Peter Chittum. I come from Sierra Madre, California.
Oh. And if you were a type of Apex function, what would you be and why?
I would be a connect API function because I like social.
Very good, there you go. This is a bit blind date now. Do you want to introduce yourself properly?
I'm Peter Chittum. I am Senior Director of Developer Relations. My job is to be a developer evangelist, and also I lead the developer evangelist team.
Cool. And seamless slide. My name is Paul Battisson. I don't know why I had to check the slide then to find out what my own name was. This is going well so far. I'm a Salesforce MVP, as you can see from the badge. That might not be around a lot longer, so let's keep on using it while we can. And I'm also the COO of Cloud Galacticos and run the Leads developer group.
And apparently we both like pictures. Wait.
The other way.
Ready? With mics on our faces for some reason. So I don't know. That was a weird coincidence that we didn't plan.
It was proof for Keir that we'd spoken before. So this is going to be a bit of just a random walk through things really, so Evergreen is going to be exciting. Who here has, other than the wonderful session we just had, did we mention Evergreen in the last one or did we skip it? Who here was here last week with Wade and heard Wade talk about Evergreen? Fantastic. Who's heard of Evergreen at all? Okay, a bit more of the room. So Evergreen's going to be big. It's a really exciting piece of technology, and Peter's going to talk more through some of that in a bit. And Peter, cover your ears, there's been a bit of marketing around the term serverless and functions as a service and microservices, and not just all from Salesforce. I mean, Amazon and Hacker News and everyone else likes to tell you that it's the sexy, hot new thing, and I like to call a bit of BS about stuff. So we're going to do a bit of calling BS tonight and really understand what serverless and microservices and functions as a service are really. So let's start off by talking about what is serverless. So who here has even heard of serverless computing? Who here thinks they've done serverless computing? Okay, like 2 of you. Well, those hands are all going to go up in a minute. So serverless computing is a cloud computing execution model in which the cloud provider runs the server and dynamically manages the allocation of machine resources. That is from Wikipedia, which is obviously, as we all know, the main source of knowledge in the universe. It's basically the Hitchhiker's Guide nowadays, isn't it? And so yeah, this is a definition of what serverless computing is, and serverless computing really just means running without a server. So who here can remember when AWS first launched? A number of years back, right? What was the first computing product that AWS launched, anyone? S3, all right, and following that? EC2. And what is EC2 and up? Go on, you're just getting grilled now, man. Shouldn't have started. Elastic Cloud Computing. EC2 is literally you saying, I don't want to have this box in my office, but can I have this box somewhere I don't know about? If you've used EC2, you literally specify the hardware you want, and it's just a server in the cloud. That was what cloud computing was to start off with. It was literally just taking a server that you had and saying, I don't want the heat in my office. Anyone who remembers having a server in their office remembers there would be a corner of the room where you go by if you were cold, and then, I once worked in an office where genuinely, everyone just stayed 20 feet away, and a small fire once started on some paper because it got that hot. It's awful. So that was what cloud computing was originally. It was moving servers to someone else's data store, and you just paid for them. Serverless computing is this fantastic new model that's going to revolutionize the world, where you don't have servers. But if you listen to this kind of definition, it sounds kind of familiar, because I've heard of a cloud computing platform where I don't have to set up servers, that manages it all for me, that scales resources that I need to, and I'm just trying to remember the name. Not Dynamics, no. Oh yeah, it's Salesforce. So literally everyone in this room has been doing serverless computing for, well, as long as you've been doing Salesforce. So who here has been doing serverless computing? Right, anyone not got their hands up now really needs to go doesn't matter. But that's it, who here actually did server-based development back in, the 90s or whatever it was? right? How much of a ball ache, we're recording, so how much of a pain was, we'll just edit later, snap. How much of a pain was deploying a server, right? Yep, it was awful.
Even worse, client server.
Oh, yeah, I mean, we'll all have a drink later and share PTSD about that. But you had to set up your own logins, and then someone would break something somewhere. If you managed a Windows server, you had to worry about Patch Tuesdays. Anyone ever been a server admin and had to sit there on a Tuesday and cross your fingers that nothing happened? Yeah. It was awful. It was just disgusting. And then, like, if you did Linux servers, you had to guess the 10 commands that you needed to remember to hope it would run properly, and then Google it. So it sucked. And so that's why we all started using Salesforce, because we didn't have to deal with that. And so we've all been doing serverless for a while. So serverless is a very familiar concept to us. So whenever someone, whenever you're at a coffee shop and someone's there looking very hipster, telling you that they're all into serverless computing and they don't understand why you're looking at Salesforce, it's too enterprise, man. You just say, I've been doing that for years. You're a bit behind the times. And then see what happens. So the next thing that happened after serverless was this idea of functions as a service. And functions as a service is just the next step in the as a service model. And we've all heard of a number of different as a service areas. So it all started off with infrastructure as a service. That's a real baseline. And that was kind of like EC2, where I didn't want to have to deal with an electricity bill. I didn't want to have to deal with like a server being physically somewhere. I wanted to use someone else's infrastructure for me, okay? And IaaS, I've never really learned how to pronounce that properly. That was kind of one of the big draws for a long time, and you saw a lot of big enterprise companies in particular moving to this so they didn't have to have a data center somewhere. We then had containers as a service. Who's ever deployed something on Kubernetes or Docker lightweight containers or that? Just a couple of you guys. How much fun was that?
It's okay.
Yeah, that's all we need to know. It was okay. It is okay. I mean, it's basically saying this is what my server should look like. Please pretend it looks like this, and deploying it and scaling like that. So we had CAS. We've then got PaaS on top of that, and that is a platform as a service where you abstract away more and more stuff. And all we're doing here is just pretending the stuff below doesn't exist. Every layer of this is just pretending it doesn't exist. So Heroku as a platform as a service runs on AWS with a bunch of containers, and that is running the AWS infrastructure. All of these different layers are just abstracting away stuff that we don't need to worry about. Because when we're running and building apps, 90% of the time, we don't care about it. As long as my app runs, do you think that my customer cares whether it's running on, a CentOS 10.7 server or a Microsoft Windows, whatever version of that is now, server? No one cares. No one does. Go and have a chat with a business person about it and see if they give any sort of, would be recorded, any sort of damn about it. On top of that, we then now have functions as a service. And again, this is the latest abstractions where what we're saying is, instead of worrying about setting up a platform where you have to worry about how things are running, how they're communicating together, and how they're all functioning as a coordinated unit on a platform and deploying a full app, you're just going to be able to deploy a function. Because all we're suggesting now is that a lot of apps are simple functions linked together. And so people like Netflix really kind of pushed this idea. So Netflix was the first real microservices success story. Has anyone ever read the, I'm sure it was a blog post, but it might have been a white paper or something that Netflix wrote about how they manage their microservices at scale? Nope, so go away and Google that. If you've got half an hour, it's a really interesting read, and then Google Chaos Monkey. So Netflix have a, yeah, there you go, someone recognized it. Netflix have a service called Chaos Monkey that just goes around and breaks stuff. And so, whenever you're using Netflix and it just suddenly says it can't find it and you know damn well that it was working 2 seconds ago, that's probably somewhere in the background, Chaos Monkey just breaking it to make sure it still works. It's a really clever system, but it's again just an abstraction away where what we're saying is we don't need to care about how the platform is running, what it's running on, what server it's using, anything like that. We just care about this particular function running. And this is really good for one-off jobs, repeatable tasks, or things that we need to scale rapidly. And then on top of that, we have the ultimate abstraction, which is SaaS. Anyone here used a SaaS system before? There was a surprisingly low amount of hands there. So that's the ultimate abstraction. You don't care about it. You pay for someone else to deal with all of this. And that's all these things are, is different abstraction layers. So when someone tells you they're talking about functions as a service, I'll move out of the way here. All you have to worry about is where you are on the abstraction chain, okay? And so functions as a service sound really sexy and new, but they're just kind of a halfway rebranding between two things. So whenever someone starts telling us about functions as a service, what does it actually mean in terms of how things are set up? So let's say we've built a super app, and we're going to be millionaires. You know, I've raised venture capital. It's a unicorn. Doesn't do anything, but I'm a billionaire. And there's 3 microservices we have. And microservices are just, you know, small operators and small sets of functions. Sorry, I thought he was going to come and hit me for saying something. Just PTSD again from being spat by Peter before. So microservices are just sets of functions around a common utility or use case. So we can have some login functions, and we have a login microservice. You might have a payment microservice. You might have an orders microservice. And typically the way these things are separated is either by business function or by some sort of team ownership. Okay, it's a bit of a loose terminology. But microservices have been available on Salesforce for a while. You just have to architect your application properly. So you can do it using platform events. Platform events allow you to have very discrete areas of code that only communicate via the platform events and via triggers. Easy enough to do. The way that functions as a service breaks this down further is that you define unique, discrete functions. Typically, these are ones that can be repeatedly run, and the word for that escapes me now. What's the correct scientific term or computer science term for something that can be run many, many times with the same result? Idempotent, thank you. I had like omnipotent, but that was a completely different thing. That's way off. So idempotent, thank you. So ideally, you want your functions to be idempotent. That means that if you give them the same input, they will give the same output again and again and again. And this is one of the big reasons we've seen the rise of functional programming languages as well. JavaScript has become sexy, not just because it's the most widely distributed language and can run on a toaster, but also because it can be a very powerful functional language. Elixir, Erlang, what are some of the others that are? Clojure, Kotlin, there you go. All of these things have really, there you go. Ask Pete for a load of languages later on. They've all become really, really popular because they allow functions to run in a very repeatable manner and really separate this down into small modules. So all we're doing again here is our dry principles. Who here has heard of the dry principle when it comes to programming? What does it mean? Don't repeat yourself. You want one function to do one thing again and again and again. All we're actually doing with a lot of this stuff is just following the rules we've had for years, but we now have enough big toys to play with to allow us to do it properly. So now that we've looked at all of these very exciting terms and understand that they're things we've used before many, many times, let's start segueing into Evergreen by talking about the different programming tools we have within Salesforce. So what tools do we have? And when do we use them? And more importantly, are they functions as a service? Because, you know, all we know about a function is that it's something that we run and performs a particular output, and that's it. So let's talk about Batch Apex. Batch Apex, who here's used a Batch Apex job before? Fantastic, good half of the room. So we use Batch Apex when we've got really large jobs that we want to bulk process. Up to 50 million, I think, is the limit currently. I'm looking at Keir because he knows all the governor limits. If you haven't seen his governor limit tattoo, ask later. And they're just functions that we write that live by themselves. You can't call a Batch Apex function from elsewhere and expect it to return instantaneously. They kind of run off, they're separated. So are Batch Apex functions as a service? Well, sort of. You call them, they scale, they use the resources they need to. They're not exactly functions as a service because you don't pay based upon their usage, but in one way, they sort of are. Future methods. I love future methods. Future methods are, to me, the closest that Salesforce currently gets with functions as a service, because you write a function, it can only take in a small subset of data types and parameters. It does that action, and then it ends. It doesn't care what's going on around it. You can't call it in line. It just goes off and does its thing. And if you wanted to coordinate an entire system in future methods, aside from being ever so slightly mental, you could do it. I mean, there's a limitation as to how many calls you get a day, but it's a fairly high limit. I think it's like 1 million a day or something stupid. There's a lot you can use. It might not be 1 million. It might be 250,000 per day, and so many you can queue at once. But for most applications, you'd probably be all right with that. So if you've got a job that you don't need to do instantaneously and only need some primitives taking in, future methods are a really good way of doing that and a really repeatable way of using them. And it allows you to separate your code out into these discrete modules. Queueable Apex. Who here has used Queueable Apex? Okay, that's more than I was expecting because this doesn't get a lot of fanfare. So Queueable Apex, you define jobs, you put them in a queue, you can order things, you can set new jobs going from them, and you can run through big things. It's a little bit like a sibling of Batch Apex is the way I think about it. Sorry, I know this poor cameraman keeps on having to move now, as I can't stand still. But again, is it really functions as a service? Probably not. This one, it's queuable, you have to order things, you have to know what you're doing. But again, it's discrete, it runs asynchronously. It doesn't matter where it's being called in the chain, it will go off and do its thing. Scheduled Apex. If anyone's ever used Lambda functions, you'll know that one of the things you can do is you can schedule Lambda functions to run at particular times. Lambda is the kind of pin-up for functions as a service. Azure Functions are also available, and I think GCP has something called Google Cloud Functions probably. They're all able to be scheduled. So again, Scheduled Apex is another option for us when we're thinking about how we can run our system as a functions as a service setup. I mentioned platform events already. A couple of years back, I did a talk at Dreamforce around an org I'd worked on where we took a set of large requirements and broke the org down into being a series of microservices using platform events. Platform events are really scalable. They're easy to work with. They trigger near instantaneously. I've never had a real slowdown in them. They work wonderfully, and you can also fire them off platform so you can coordinate different services together. So platform events are a good way of running things for microservices, and if you make your triggers discrete enough, for functions as a service. Triggers themselves, following on from this, are a form of a function as a service. Functions as a service are executed when an event occurs. Triggers fire when specific events occur. That's literally the definition. So triggers themselves, if you encapsulate your triggers, who here doesn't use a trigger handler pattern? That is the right answer. I'm very pleased with that. It was a trick question. I was waiting for one person to put up their hand thinking I'd said it the other way. But yeah, triggers themselves, fantastic option. Outbound messages. Who here uses outbound messages regularly in development? That is shocking. Absolutely shocking. Outbound messages are a fantastic tool for integrating systems. They're point and click. They work nicely. I know this is a developer group, so it's not all clicks, not code, but outbound messages can really help you piece together things in a seamless manner. So again, especially if you're working with anything that's a SOAP API or has a SOAP API, consider outbound messages. Are they functions as a service? Well, we don't necessarily write the function for it, but if we're integrating to Salesforce orgs, for example, they're a good way of connecting that together. And finally, invokable methods. These, for me, are also really close to functions as a service because they give us a number of ways of invoking them. Invokable methods can be invoked via flow. They can be invoked via code. You could invoke them via triggers if you write your code properly. The invokable method can call another method. All you're doing is you're presenting an interface to that method. So if you want to think about how you can structure your code to enable you to be more functional and separate code out, invokable methods are another good option. All of these things can be combined together. All of these things can be combined together so that if you have a method that's doing something, all you have to do is make it available to these different interfaces so that it can be fired when it's needed. So we have a lot of tools available to us that may be more functional than we realize. And so when we think about Evergreen, why has Salesforce bothered with Evergreen, aside from millions of dollars of investment in it apparently already? Why have they bothered to put Evergreen together when we have some options? Well, typically it's for doing things that we might do when we go off platform. And so there are a number of reasons we might go off platform. The big three areas are: number one, large data volumes. If you are ever working with masses of data and you need it processed, really, really rapidly, or you need it available maybe through like a highly available API, for example, you might go off platform. So I've built systems where we had 70 odd million records that we needed to be able to query quickly. That was done on Heroku. Heroku is Salesforce's tool for engagement apps. That's why you might use it, is to get data from Heroku Connect and surface it through an API. So if you're using large data volumes, you might go off platform to process. If you have a high throughput API, you might go off platform as well. The other reason is if you have a library or a function you want to use. Who here has ever tried writing some Apex code and it just not be able to do something that you know you can do in another language? Or that if you Google on NPM, there's about 50 different options, 3 of which have been maintained, 10 of which just run on different versions and are broken. That's one of the biggest challenges for Apex right now, is that there's no NPM for Apex, is there? There's no way of just going and saying, I need a library that's going to allow me to process an image or do something. So that's one of the other reasons. And that's really where I think Salesforce are positioning Evergreen, is looking at particularly the large data volumes, which I think Peter's going to talk about when we discuss throughput for Evergreen. And, well, there's hopefully a picture on the slide, and also unavailable libraries and functions when we talk about how you can use Evergreen through different languages. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through serverless, functions as a service, the fact that Salesforce is probably trendier and cooler with these things than you thought, and hopefully a bit of a reason why we might use Evergreen. So, over to Peter.
I love that presentation because it does set the stage really well to understand that there's actually a lot you can do with Apex with what is on the platform today. And I think helps underscore that none of that's going to change. The things that that work well with what you're doing on the platform today still will work well going forward. But I love how that last slide really sets up the what's missing. And yeah, that's really the question. So when Paul roped me into this and asked if Salesforce would bring some stuff about Evergreen, I said I would do my best to try and find a demo and to get prepped for that. We're in the process right now where, does anyone know when GA is due for Spring 20? Monday. So Spring 20 is when the closed developer preview is happening for Evergreen, and there's a lot going on, and so I wasn't able to get a stable demo working. And in addition to that, the Evergreen team, when I spoke to them, what they asked was to make this very conversational. And for those of you who felt like you bumped into limits using Apex, or that you would like to do something that could live in a type of function as a service off-platform, I'd love to hear some of your feedback after we've gone through a few slides and talked about that. So this slide actually pops up, really the vision for Evergreen, and there's a lot of words on here, but fundamentally, a lot of what Paul talked about really applies, which is, one really key differentiator is elastic scale. Salesforce has done an amazing job of scaling over the years in a very linear fashion. Licenses are bought per seat, however, and if you need a very large load to be dealt with today, but not tomorrow, and you just want to pay for that load, that's something that, unless you went to Heroku or some other elastic scale architecture, Salesforce didn't really, couldn't help you with that. So that's one of the value propositions that they've talked about. They want to be able to allow you to use alternate languages. So in going GA, And actually, I think for the developer preview, we're going to have the options for Node.js, Java, and Apex as programming languages. What else? Anything else we want to comment here? So the other bits that are really important, which, because if you just wanted those, you could do them today with Heroku. But what they didn't have was sharing the same trust boundary as Salesforce, being tightly coupled with your platform, being able to have them be part of your project that you're working on and have them deployed as part of the rest of the project as well. So those are all things that when they looked at what would a functions as a service that worked with the Salesforce platform look like, they wanted it to provide those kinds of values, those kinds of benefits for our developers, so that you wouldn't have to do the extra wiring up of getting that function of the service sitting on that infrastructure out there to talk to Salesforce, for instance. So tightly coupled with Salesforce data and services, operates within the Salesforce trust boundary, and then packaging support, obviously, for our ISVs. Are there any ISV developers in the room today? None? To be honest. But we're really interested in hearing how that could work. Okay, now I included this slide just to set some context around, as I said, Spring 20 is this closed developer preview. It's going to have a very small number of customers. I'll give you some, really the information if you'd like to participate is to talk to your account executive. And for the developer preview, it really is just a function as a service. So you get a runtime, you get a file system, and that's pretty much it. For GA, they also want some additional managed data stores, so I'll kind of show you a sort of architecture slide to give you an idea what that looks like. And then sometime in the future, being able to sort of weave together several functions as a service into a sort of microservice is where they're looking in the future. So this architecturally is what we're looking at, where the serverless runtime here is what is actually going to be deployed as a container. There will be a number of native ways to invoke this from within your org. So you could directly invoke it from Apex, it could be fired from a platform event or from change data capture. You could potentially have it called from a flow, for instance. Or directly from Lightning Web Components. So those are all things that we're looking at as far as what could invoke them. Talked about tightly coupled with the org. So obviously there's some context that is provided to the function when it's invoked that allows the function to access your org's data, to interact with the org, et cetera, et cetera. And there's also some information about who the user is that's invoked this, so that it is done securely within the context of that org's permissions. So the same permissions that apply to the data in that org will apply to the data as you access it through the function. And then as far as some managed data stores that we're looking at, so Postgres, Redis, and Kafka are all things that already run on the Heroku infrastructure, and so those are what we're looking at as we add those for the GA timeframe. Okay, and this brings us to a little bit of code. I told you I didn't get a demo, but I do have a little bit of code to look at. So the first thing, obviously this is a Node.js version of a function. And the couple of things that to call attention to, passed into the function are a payload and context parameter. The payload obviously is the data that is being brought into the function to work on. Okay, now I included this slide just to set some context around, as I said, Spring 20 is this closed developer preview. It's going to have a very small number of customers. I'll give you some, really the information if you'd like to participate is to talk to your account executive. And for the developer preview, it really is just a function as a service. So you get a runtime, you get a file system, and that's pretty much it. For GA, they also want some additional managed data stores, so I'll kind of show you a sort of architecture slide to give you an idea what that looks like. and then sometime in the future being able to sort of weave together several functions as a service into a sort of microservice is where they're looking in the future. So this architecturally is what we're looking at, where the serverless runtime here is what is actually going to be deployed as a container. There will be a number of native ways to invoke this from within your org. So you could directly invoke it from Apex, it could be fired from a platform event or from change data capture. You could potentially have it called from a flow, for instance. Or directly from Lightning Web Components. So those are all things that we're looking at as far as what could invoke them. Talked about tightly coupled with the org. So obviously there's some context that is provided to the function when it's invoked that allows the function to access your org's data, to interact with the org, et cetera, et cetera. And there's also some information about who the user is that's invoked this, so that it is done securely within the context of that org's permissions. So the same permissions that apply to the data in that org will apply to the data as you access it through the function. And then as far as some managed data stores that we're looking at, so Postgres, Redis, and Kafka are all things that already run on the Roku infrastructure, and so those are what we're looking at as we add those toward the G8 timeframe. Okay, and this brings us to a little bit of code. I told you I didn't get a demo, but I do have a little bit of code to look at. So the first thing, obviously this is a Node.js version of a function. And the couple of things that to call attention to, passed into the function are a payload and context parameter. The payload obviously is the data that is being brought into the function to work on. Context is your interaction with your Salesforce environment. So anything to do with interacting with the database, permissions, that sort of thing, context gives you a handle to that. And part of that is a unit of work structure. Is anyone familiar with the enterprise architecture? Yeah. So this comes from a pretty standard enterprise architectural pattern called unit of work. Has anyone watched or ever seen any of Andy Fawcett's presentation? So Andy Fawcett is one of the leads product for this, and I can kind of see his influence in there as well. So he's very much a proponent of that, and has written books about enterprise patterns for Apex, and in fact has a Trailhead module that he created for it. So there's my Trailhead plug for the night.
The book's very good as well.
What's that?
The book's very good as well.
The book is very good. So unit of work is just a way to wrap several bits of an interaction into a single transaction. And in this particular case, you can see the payload is a list of orders that we're just iterating over. And then we create those. Each one of those gets added to the unit of work, and then we commit that transaction at the end. So you can see where the different pieces are playing into this as far as the payload, the context itself. Anything else I wanted to do? No, I think that's it for this one. The next slide goes into a little bit more. And the things that I think are good to call attention to here is, first of all, you can see where the different Salesforce structures are coming from as far as the import from the Salesforce SDK that's related to Evergreen. The other thing that's interesting is that we're bringing in what is just a standard NPM module called PDFKit to do this operation. So clearly we're going to be generating a PDF using some data. And we're also interacting with the file system using the standard Node FS module. We still have the unit of work, we have our payload, our context. Again, context is where we get the unit of work for, but we also see context used here to invoke a query. So again, interacting with the Salesforce database. And just to reiterate that that's going to be run in the context of the user. So the permission set that has been applied to that user will apply to that as well. And then I think the rest of this is, yeah, so again, we're interacting with the unit of work here. The one additional bit, so looks like there's a helper function called generate PDF that must be wrapping the PDF kit functionality, where we're going to go and actually create the actual PDF files itself. And then we do some updates, and again, finish with our unit of work commit. So it just gives you a little bit of a taste of what this will look like. And I think the other nice thing is it demystifies this and kind of gives you an idea that this is pretty straightforward. Obviously, there's maybe some work to get the PDF kits to stuff working, but the actual interaction with the Salesforce database is really analogous to what an Apex developer might expect to do in Apex directly, with not a whole lot of fanfare, to be honest, which is kind of how we like it: simple, straightforward. The last thing I'll show code-wise is some examples of invoking a function from Apex. So the two models that they're looking to support with regards to Apex, one is an asynchronous model. So your Apex would fire this, register a listener, or a callback, basically, and then the function would go off and do its work. Sometime in the future, the callback would be invoked, and then things would ensue from there. The other example is a synchronous invocation. And so the one that's kind of peeking from behind is just a direct synchronous invocation. This is a function that we've retrieved from the list of functions and directly called the invoke method on. The other one, when we call invoke, we're actually invoking it with this new generic response handler class here. And so that's actually the thing that's going to register the callback for that function. And that's pretty much it for that one as well. So again, this shows a direct from Apex invocation. And then, this is a picture of a flow. And ostensibly, that would be the part of the flow that would invoke your function. Just to make sure that people understand that, when a function is created, the idea of that function is that there's a contract that can be, invoked no matter how the function is created. So whether that function is created in JavaScript, Java, Apex, that contract looks the exact same from the part of Salesforce that is invoking it. In other words, the implementation details of your function shouldn't influence how you actually invoke that. And that way we can make sure that we can invoke them from different places. All right. So that kind of brings us to, what is my next slide? I'm drawing a blank at this moment. There we go. So we've talked about a few use cases. And then I was hoping to do a little bit of listening to your thoughts, questions, ideas, and that sort of thing, especially if there's any feedback that I can take back to the product team. For them, one of the values in beginning to talk about this early is to hear from you, and especially, what are the things that you've run into as limits using Apex, using Salesforce platform today that you think could be potential candidates for running functions in your orgs or in your environments. But certainly some of the things that we've looked at as options, things like financial calculations, work order generation, so heavy duty database transactions potentially. I already mentioned about elastic computing, so image file processing, really demanding queries, or very peaky loads that might correspond to sort of consumer and user behavior that can be very volatile. And then reusable backend logic like data validation and cleansing, and then building web APIs over your data. So those kinds of things potentially could be there as well. But again, what are you thinking about? Like, where would you use a function, do you think? I saw a hand kind of maybe start to go up. Yeah?
Yeah, so I think the use case might be, well, I'm thinking about maybe having a web scraper which scrapes the interwebs for like clients, and then if some sort of news around that client happens, then it would create a platform event in the Salesforce instance so that the salespeople who manage that could sort of get kind of real-time news as an example.
So I'm going to repeat that because that won't have heard it. So a web scraper that's combing the interwebs for information that has come out about clients, and if that information is discovered, then it triggers some kind of notification to agents or something that tags that client that informs their agents that something's gone on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that would be like using Puppeteer, which is like the node module to scrape stuff.
Using
so
Puppeteer.
That would be invoked. That would be invoked from Salesforce. That would just be like a cron job in the container, which would just be like running every 5 minutes, however we define it. So, but yeah, that's something that just sprang to mind.
Well, so if you have direct from Apex invocation, then you have scheduled Apex as a way to, right, as the way that I would probably think about that. That's really interesting. Okay. I have a thing for doing notes, so I'm going to really quickly switch to that. All right, cool. What else? Oh, and by the way, it doesn't just have to be use cases. If you have general questions, or if you're, anything else that could be used to clarify that I can answer, I will, or I'll say I can't answer that. So, it's all is fair at this point. Yes.
Yes, I'll do it. So we have a use case. It's a rules engine for calculating quite complex entitlements or access permissions that are heavily data driven. And there are lots of different permutations why people might or might not need to have permission, and they can be reevaluated quite regularly as data changes. It's just very computationally expensive and intensive, and quite data heavy as well. So it's a really good case of something that would run off the platform effectively.
Cool. Great idea. Yeah.
So based off of that, so like hitting the CPU limits, and if you want to start chaining it, sometimes in Apex it's quite complex to set up that kind of architecture. If you can do that in a way that's priced or governed differently using a different language like Java or Node.js, if it can do something like that where you can just write it nice and clean and you can chug through it.
So I think that fits. So let me see if I can repeat that. When trying to orchestrate around the limits in Apex, you end up with fairly convoluted ways to work around that, and something more straightforward that would scale. Do you have a specific example or any?
I mean, it's like the entitlements. If you're doing any you've got complex rules that calculate what should be permissioned.
Right.
And stuff like that, and you need to create potentially a lot of data off the back of that.
Well, that's interesting. So, like complex permission calculation, like actually using Salesforce permissions?
Potentially.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it's just
So I thought we did that for you. But I'd love to hear more about that, and I think that's intriguing. Yeah. Okay.
So basically, our use case is with forecasting. So the trouble we have is that obviously you can do forecasting within Salesforce with sort of limited data, but the way we want to model it is based on sort of IFRS principles, which means you have to generate a lot more data before you are able to do the forecasting. So what we are thinking is getting this data out of Salesforce, processing it outside, and then bringing it back. I think probably where this might come in is that we need to use the data that we have in our system, and it needs to be real time and everything. But the thing is to build everything within Salesforce, even if we have to reskin something, it takes quite a lot of effort basically, especially with all the data that we need to process. So between, we are looking between different solutions. One is using out of the box of, product schedules to kind of do this, but the amount of data we eventually have, it may not work, so we are kind of testing it at the moment. So with this, probably if we can take that out, do the processing, maybe even show the skin somewhere else or maybe within Salesforce, and then bring it all back together, I think that's going to be a great one for us.
Okay, and you use an acronym that I'm not familiar with, so I'm gonna ask you about that in a second. So IFRS.
1.5.
What's that?
15.
IFRS 1.5.
So this is like a revenue sort of recognition standard, which we were not willing to do that within Salesforce in terms of forecasting, but it's been sort of imposed on us because for some reason our billing system is not very capable of handling it very well.
Yeah, IFRS is International Financial Reporting.
Hey, hang on. Yeah. So is that right? So there's too much data to really handle it on platform as today.
Yeah.
I appreciate the clarifying the acronym for me. It's one of those type and listen at the same time things. But yeah. Yes.
I use a QR code generator.
A QR code generator. That's funny. I think that's one of the things that we talk about a lot as a really good, basic, straightforward demo. That you can't really do that on platform today. So. Anything else? Oh, here.
So mine's more about, I find these days in large enterprise implementations, I'm always battling CPU time, and various things go asynchronous, and they don't have to happen in every transaction, but every now and then you get a perfect storm, where suddenly we've got 5 or 6 things that need to happen asynchronously. You're trying to orchestrate how that happens, and then you start butting up against other limits, the limits to the maximum number of scheduled jobs you can have, and the maximum number of queuables that you can have in the queue, etc. So I think that this will be a really good way of being able to fire and forget effectively, and not have to worry about wrestling with CPU.
Yeah, is that good?
Mm-hmm.
So wrestling. That's what right? Yeah, it is. Okay. Paul.
Mixed DML.
Mixed DML. Okay, I'll put that down.
Especially in communities use cases in particular, when you're asked to register a user and then you have to do some work on the contact and some related records and then some work on the user.
Cool, great.
Something to
Do that?
Excel. So currently we have to do everything using CSV files. So something if you want to do using Microsoft Excel, like printing an Excel document instead of a CSV file.
Rendering an Excel document instead of a CSV file.
So it has the formatting along with it.
Okay. I'm going to make that one sort of generic because I think you could sort of plug in maybe half a dozen different document formats like PDF, Excel, maybe some others, CAD files, that kind of thing. So. Okay, cool. I already got one from you, so I'm going to pick some of you. I'll get back to you, I promise.
It's more of a question really. So if this is now moving functions out of the existing platform, out of Apex, how much is this really the second version of the platform? So how much of the code and functionality do you see us actually taking out of what we've got existing, sticking here because it's no limits, you can do what you want,
I wouldn't say no limits. I wouldn't say no limits. I'm sure I didn't say no limits.
I'm just trying to figure out what the long-term aim of this really is.
So I had a really interesting conversation with Andy, and the reality is, if there are things that need to be done transactionally, Apex triggers, like these are still a really, really good option, and there will be a certain amount of transactional processing that will always need to go forward in the future. Where this comes in, I think where it's going to be a differentiator is specifically where you have asynchronous processing. And I think asynchronous processing that fits a particular profile even, rather than just generally speaking. How that's all going to end up, I think is anybody's guess. But the reality is we are investing in Apex today, and we're investing in new options for our developers to solve problems better. And that's really where this fits in. So, anything could happen, but the reality is the investment is very strong on both sides to give you the best tools, whether that is transactional processing in Apex as it looks like today, and probably a lot of the problems that people have kind of stuck together with spit and baling wire, in transactional processing on Apex, those are the kind of things where you start to see functions as a service and Evergreen come to the fore. Whereas, where things still can be transactional, they'll stay that way. Does that help a little bit? Yeah.
Can I give a 2-sentence view on that?
Yeah, you got it.
Sorry, I'll rehold this for a second. So one of the key things that just mix up the microphones. One of the key things that Peter had on the slide was about the fact that this is within that security boundary and knows the context. So the biggest issue with going off platform for doing any of these big jobs now, like if you go to Heroku or AWS or Azure or whatever it might be, you completely lose all of the security, all of the setup, all of your permissions, everything else, all of that context that is around it. So personally, and to clarify, I don't work for Salesforce, I have only spoken to Pete about this briefly, and our conversation was, have you got some slides? Yeah, that's it, that's cool. It wasn't in any depth, I have no safe harbor, no knowledge, he says, looking at the camera to clear himself. But I don't see this as being a replacement for Apex and for what you're doing. I see it being a way of saying, don't go off platform to do this. That's the key thing about it, is it's saying to you, if you're doing these large scale deployments and hitting up these large volume limits and things like that, as soon as you go off platform, you then have to deal with all the security and all the implications around that. Whereas by having Evergreen, you can stay on platform, you stay within that context, you stay within that security, and from an IT management perspective, from an enterprise management perspective, it's much easier in terms of governance. So I wouldn't see them as either or like one replacing the other. I would see them as working in tandem to really reduce that kind of bottleneck, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get what you mean. I think it's just because it's so obviously tightly coupled, you still got security, it just feels like an awful lot of what we've got is kind of being replicated in a bigger, more potentially powerful version. So it does just make you start to wonder, although it extends what you can do now, is it just
so I would also suggest that Salesforce have a very clever pricing team. They're going to make sure that you're not going to move everything off onto Evergreen for some reason or another, and that is just my estimate. I have no idea. It's like with platform events. There's a reason you get a free allocation of platform events and can't do everything on platform events without paying for a larger volume.
I mean, Peter started looking nervous when he said pricing, so that's
Yeah. You should talk to your account executive about the relevant pricing model. Would anyone like Pardot?
I have a little Einstein figure that says you should talk to your account executive. You had a question, I think.
Yeah, I think we have used similar thing using AWS Lambda. The scenario was dark data volume, where we had a large amount of leads in a certain system outside Salesforce. We didn't want to store it within Salesforce because of the cost of the storing it. I didn't want to have data which is not, or the leads which are not warm enough to be converted into order opportunity. So that's one scenario probably we can use this to bring the data or the required data into Salesforce in the certain scenarios. But I think my question would be similar to what everyone else seems to be asking, how much cost, because we, in my previous projects, we've done lots of AWS Lambda Serverless things, and if you believe me, our cost, it was a quite big project, and all the volume in terms of transactions, and cost of using AWS Lambda like in less than 1,000 in some of the years. So it all depends, adoption will depend how much Salesforce is going to price it.
Yeah.
You should reach out to your account executive to discuss.
Well, actually, don't today, because they won't know what to say. They're far enough to even have to really put any pricing in place. No, I think the pricing question is obviously the question that's going to make a big difference, and that is a discussion that will be had not at the developer group, but in other places. So yeah, but I do know based on Wade his discussion last week, the Evergreen team is just as interested in understanding what's the right way to price this.
Free.
You didn't shout that last week, I did. Familiarity breeds contempt, what can I say? They definitely would love to hear feedback, like what would be the right way to price this that would give that would be advantageous. You already have, and Wade alluded to some models. That was Wade. He has the product team, so he can do that. I'm not even going to go there. There will be a pricing scheme, I can tell you that much. I can also tell you I don't know what it is or what it will be. Yes?
Do you know what if there's any aspirational dates for when this might go into regular developer preview rather than private?
I've been asked to not talk about roadmap tonight, actually.
But I've just asked you to talk about it.
I know.
That's it. That's a yes, but no.
You don't pay my paycheck here, so yeah. So as of now, obviously, the next phase is developer preview, and we'll see where it goes from there. I don't know if I'll say that. Yes, Amanda.
Will it have a mascot?
Would you like a big tree mascot?
Yeah.
I'll be sure to send Dominique a message and find out if they've approached her, and maybe she'll help make an Evergreen mascot happen. Okay, any other questions? All right. I think that's it. So, thank you very much. Actually, hang on. I do have a couple more slides to wrap up with. Okay, so the final word and official word on what's going on with Evergreen is in two specific locations. One is the Salesforce developer blog. So there is a blog out there that talks about this. If you go to the Dreamforce 19 developer keynote at time index 1044, you can see Andy Fawcett talking about Evergreen himself and hear what he had to say about that. And then if you are interested in the developer preview, reach out to your account manager, talk to them, and we'll see what we can do. Yes, there's a thank you slide. Thanks very much, everybody.